Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Michael Maggiato, Dean of the College of Sciences and Humanities. On behalf of President Joanne Gora and Provost Terry King, it's my privilege to welcome you to the annual Yom HaShoah commemoration sponsored by the Jewish Studies Project at Ball State University, the Office of the Provost, the Ball State University Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, and the Honors College. Philanthropy from the Benjamin and Bessie Ziegler Fund helped establish the Jewish Studies Project that provides the university and the community with an understanding and an appreciation of Jewish history, Jewish culture, and the Jewish faith. Specific initiatives include faculty development and course offerings in Jewish studies, library acquisitions for the Bracken Library's Judaica collection, and support for programs and cultural events such as this one. In the communications about today's event, the words Yom HaShoah were not used. Rather, the flyers and electronic advertising called it the annual Holocaust Memorial Lecture. Shoah, Holocaust. The same? Shoah is a Hebrew word, which I believe means great calamity or catastrophe. Yom HaShoah thus means day of the catastrophe. Holocaust derives from the French and Greek and means a burnt offering, often as a sacrifice to a deity. Holocaust, without capitalizing the initial letter, was used at the height of the Cold War in the 20th century to describe the aftermath of nuclear war, as in nuclear Holocaust. And I suspect there are other metaphoric and symbolic uses of the word as well. I call your attention to these words and their original meanings because the events of the 1930s and 1940s in Europe that we recall today, the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews as the result of national policy, what the Nazis termed so clinically die Endlösung der Judenfrage, or the final solution of the Jewish question, are becoming more and more remote from our immediate experience. And the words we use to name phenomena matter in the formation of memory. They matter even more as personal testimony of the events becomes harder to acquire. What we have named something helps us understand immediately its most important characteristics. If we are not to forget, if we are not to repeat, then we must understand what we are remembering. Do we remember the terrible fate of 6 million Jews as a final solution, as a burnt offering, or as a catastrophe? If it is a solution, to what problem? If it is a burnt offering or a sacrifice, then by whom, to whom, and for what? If it is a catastrophe, then who were the victims, and who were the perpetrators, and how did it happen? As you can see, part of how and what we remember addresses part of who we are. We can look at the Shoah or the Holocaust as a terrible aberration of human history, an isolated event. If we do, then it becomes less threatening to our shared humanity. But if we try to isolate it as an aberration, then we'll have to ignore other examples of genocide and ethnic cleansing, of pogroms and the disappeared, of re-education and the gulags, and the many more instances that have no names, but only a pervading silence, where once there was the commerce of human voices, the joy of love, and the laughter of children. Yes, how we remember the Shoah or the Holocaust affects the image we hold of ourselves and of what we are capable. What is conserved in our DNA that makes us vulnerable to the temptation to inflict pain and even death on another person or on another group? Some have studied the Milgram experiments in psychology, where American subjects were calmly instructed by white-coated technicians to turn up what appeared to be painful voltage on a learner who was in fact an actor, when the learner failed to answer a question correctly. And while some subjects initially objected, few refused to turn the dial at the instruction of the white-coated technician, a surrogate for authority, even when they heard the learner cry out. In fact, 65% of the subjects administered the experiment's final massive dose of 450 volts. If human beings, if Americans in the 1960s and later, long after the end of World War II and the revelations of the Shoah and the Holocaust, are that susceptible to persuasion to inflict pain, despite the evidence of their own senses and often the violation of their own conscience or professed values, how do we understand claims of ignorance when neighbors vanish, or when neighbors are threatened or harmed or even killed in plain view? Should we believe that people simply did not know? Or should we believe something else? What are the boundaries of complicity if we do not believe the claim of ignorance? Where does the cover of orders or of instructions end, and where does personal responsibility begin? Yes, what we remember and what we call things affect not simply something abstract about the human condition, or something remote or isolated in history, but also something vivid and possibly disturbing about the image of ourselves. What would it take to make us an accomplice? An accomplice even in something truly terrible. Shoah, Holocaust, die Entlösung der Judenfrage. Today we are privileged once again to hear an authentic voice, the voice of one who survived the Shoah, the Holocaust. Conrad Weiner was born in Romania in 1938, and at the age of 3.5, he was transported to a concentration camp in Transnistria with his family. He survived for almost 3 years in the camp before he was liberated by the Soviet Red Army in 1944. He emigrated to the United States in 1960, and he lives with his family in Cincinnati, Ohio. I invite you to listen to his address today, Never Again, Lessons from the Holocaust. But equally importantly, I urge you to think about a name for what he describes, a word that you will remember, a word indeed that you cannot forget. Please join me now in welcoming Mr. Conrad Weiner.
Thank you very much. That was a very eloquent speech. I learned a lot. And your introduction was so kind, I didn't recognize myself till you mentioned my name. I do like to thank all of you for the interest that you're showing on such an important occasion. There isn't much that I can add to what so eloquently has been explained to you. I will just try to add a little bit to that. But the fact that it became a Holocaust and heroism Remembrance Day. How much more heroic and defiant can you be than survive such a thing? It started out by a proclamation in Israel in 1953. True to Jewish tradition, not everybody agreed to the date. Originally, they wanted it on the 19th day of Nisan, which is a joyous holiday, joyous month, because Pesach, Passover, is during that month. So they moved it to coincide with the resistance of the Warsaw Ghetto. You may know that the resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto lasted longer than some countries with complete armies managed to hold the Nazis back. And I'm very careful to make a distinction between Nazis and Germans, as you will find out later. Traditionally, if you go by our calendar, it would fall on April the 19th this year. I understand that's too close to your final exams, so you might be too preoccupied with that. Generally, on the eve, Wednesday the 18th, most Jewish people light a candle to remember. At this time, I would like to also let you know that we are remembering the over 5 million people that died in addition to the 6 million Jews, innocent people. And if you're willing and able, I'd appreciate if you would stand up for a moment of silence. Thank you very much. Now, I ask for your indulgence. If you mind if I take off my jacket, I promise to stop there. It's quite warm here. I see a lot of students. I retired from business. You know my age, so I can tell you. 14 years ago. After 2 weeks, I realized that I cannot afford to play golf every day, and all my buddies were still working. I always like to work with young people. That keeps me young. So I became a substitute teacher. I see a lot of students here. I know how you guys work. Please, do me a favor. If you have to fall asleep, fall very gently. I do not want you to hurt yourself. On a serious note, what I will share with you comes from 3 different sources. I was only 3.5 years old when we were marched to a labor camp. We don't remember very much what we did when we were 3.5 years old. However, I was 7.5 years old when we were liberated, so towards the end of our stay, I remember something from personal experience. Another source was my mother, my aunt, and my uncle. At one time, we were fortunate to live close to each other in Cincinnati. They would get together, talk about it, cry a little. Today you would call it group therapy. But they had their cry, they had a little bit to eat, they had a little bit to drink, and they always pointed to me, don't ever forget, never again. When it became a little more comfortable, it never is easy. I did a lot of reading, and there is a lot on the internet. I found one book in particular that practically describes the same route that we took from our place to the Transnistria. It was by coincidence that I decided to accept the responsibility of speaking, because you are the last generation that you will see an actual survivor. At age 74, I repeat, age 74, just lost $5. I paid somebody to say you don't look it. Lost $5 already. Anyway, I am the youngest survivor in the tri-state area. That means anytime travel involves, I get the job. Anytime night driving involves, I get the job. And being a substitute teacher, I get all the high schools. So I was substitute teaching in a world history class in something that is considered one of the best 100 high schools in the country. One student remembered that I am from Europe. He said, Mr. W, I like them to call me Mr. W because the ones with lesser intelligence get Weiner and Weiner mixed up, and I got tired beating them up. So they called me Mr. W. You are from Europe. I said, that's correct. Did you meet Hitler? After I collected myself, I explained to him that, Europe is a rather large continent. Besides, Hitler and I traveled in different circles. So, the kid asked me, well, what did you do during the war? True story. I said, I spent 4 years in a concentration camp without batting an eye. The kid said, what were you concentrating on? I mean, you have baseball camps, you have soccer camps, you have chess camps. Why not have a camp where you sit around and concentrate on something? Fortunately, the rest of the class busted out laughing. But that kid had absolutely no clue. I have 2 lovely granddaughters, and some of those ignorant people in that tremendous high school might be part of the government someday. So in their defense and in self-defense, when I was asked by the Holocaust and Humanities Center to speak, I accepted the responsibility, and I've shared that responsibility with over 4,000 people today. Every speaker dreams to have a captive audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't mean to brag, but I had a truly captive audience of 350 women. I spoke at the Ohio Penitentiary for Women in Marysville, in Ohio. They had no place to go. Technical difficulty here, you forgive me a minute. Because I lived under Russian occupation so much, I keep asking for water, for vodka. With my accent, they give me water every time. Thank you. We can decide ourselves whether we should remain ignorant, should be compassionate, cruel, or generous. However, I appeal to your heart. I would like for you to please eliminate any traces of hatred, discrimination that you may or possibly have about. Why is it important to learn about the Holocaust? I try to find quotations from people that are smarter than I am, and that was not a very difficult job. You show here what the Transnistria had. The Holocaust provides one of the most effective subjects for examination of basic moral issues as a structured inquiry into history, and yields critical lessons on investigation, human behavior, study of the events, also addresses the mandate to study what it means to be, very important, a responsible citizen. Also, democracy is not something automatic. It needs to be appreciated, sustained, nurtured, and protected. I grew up, or I was born actually, in a small part of Romania called Bukovina. And at one time, it was occupied by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austrians, like the Germans, are very accurate with their bookkeeping. So they were totally out of their element when they found out that Jewish people did not have last names. We're called by the name of our father, and your first name and the name of our father. That was confusing for tax purposes. So they decided to give Jews last names. If you had money, you could buy any name that you wanted to. Other than that, they would assign you names. And they generally went by your occupation or by your physical attributes. For instance, if you were a tailor, your name became Schneider. You were a shoemaker, your name became Schuster, goldsmith. However, they were also, at times, romantic. My mother's middle name maiden name was Sunshine, the sun shining, Sonnenschein. My wife has an uncle, his name is Greenblatt, green leaf, and so on. Now, people ask me, how did I get the name Weiner? I was adopted by my stepfather, but on his side of the family, they're still debating it. Part of the family thinks that they were producing wine, that's why they're called Weiner. The other part said, you guys were consuming it. That's why you were called Weiner. But we had a reunion not too long ago, and it's still an ongoing debate. We were getting along with our neighbors quite well. Jews lived in that part of the country since the 14th century. They occasionally had a little pogrom, beat us up a little bit to make the hires up look good, but overall, things were not all that bad. We were not allowed to own land, and we did not have citizenship. In 1939, a Romanian government came to power that was extremely anti-Semitic. They started off by having every Jewish person wear a Star of David. That wasn't enough. We had our identity card marked with the word Jew, and they had the nerve to make it look like Hebrew letters, as you've seen in my original presentation. In 1941, the Russian army, through their non-aggression with Hitler, took over part of the country where we lived. They took all the men of military age into their army without any training, sent them to the front lines. That's how I lost my father when I was 3.5 years old. Unfortunately, I don't even remember him. My mother, who's the person right there, the poorest one, whoops, I went the wrong way. Who's the poorest one, all the way to the right, had several sisters. An order came for us to pack whatever we can carry and report to the train station the next day. As it happens, the convoy stopped in front of the house where my grandmother lived. And one of my aunts that was visiting from Palestine was with her, got caught by the war, couldn't return. My grandmother, being old and tired, wanted to rest. My aunt suggested they go in the house, sit down and rest for a while. When the convoy moves again, they were followed. Unbeknown to them, officers ordered the soldiers to check each house, make sure nobody's hiding. They found them in one of the rooms. They brought them outside, they shot them on the spot, just to intimidate, to scare the rest of the people. My cousin, who was 4 years older than I am, witnessed that, and he had a lot of psychological problems, understandably, because of that. From there, we were actually, in a sense, lucky to be taken to the train station, because other convoys in front of us were taken to the Dniester River. Machine gun shot and left there. We were carted into cattle cars. I don't know if you've ever seen one. They have these narrow windows. There's enough for animals to breathe, but not for 80, 100, 120 people. Our journey lasted for 2 days and a night. When the doors finally opened, the people that survived, the old and the very young, have perished already in transit, without food, without facilities, without, most important, water. People were begging for water. It is more difficult to get along without water than it is without food. Romanian soldiers were emptying buckets of water and laughing because people were soaking it up off the street, off the pavement, to get their lips wet. Our convoy started through what is artificially called Transnistria. It's a part of the Ukraine. It's on the other side of the Dniester River. Our journey lasted for over 2 weeks by foot, through snow, mud, rain, cold. And in the distance, you could see that looked like branches covered with snow or mud. As you got closer, you realized those were bodies just left on the side of the road. People ask me, how come you didn't try to escape? Contrary to the general belief, a lot of the young people did escape. We were sleeping in the forest, so they were just disappearing in the forest, joining the Russian underground, the partisans. Other people just froze during the night. My uncle, you see him in the middle picture all the way to your right, he was a very strong guy, and he had some army experience. So he was carrying me, and when my cousin got tired, he would let me walk a little bit and carry my cousin. And his military experience taught him to make sure that we sleep in shifts, make sure that we don't freeze to death. And this is how we continued for over 2 weeks till we got to a small little town called Budi, B-U-D-I. It is so small, ladies and gentlemen, I can't even find it on Google. And our accommodation left a lot to be desired. We were housed in stalls and barns where the animals were left. We were sleeping on the floor on straw, crowded. It was like a domino effect. When somebody turned, everybody practically had to turn with them to keep along. Ingenuity flared. They found a barrel. Who knows what was in that barrel? Downsprout from a bombed out house. They made a stove. And that served for us to keep warm and also for cooking. Because the Ukrainian men were also taken in the Russian army, the women were left behind to work the fields. Originally, we traded whatever we bought that we could, our clothing or whatever, in exchange for food. A lot of their clothing was lost on the march. People would line up, the Ukrainians. They take somebody that has like maybe a coat with a fur color, or a suitcase that looks like it might contain something valuable. They would buy that person from the soldiers, kill the person for their belongings. Looking at me now, you wouldn't believe it, but I was very skinny and sick. And I only survived because of the heroic effort of my mother. The people in our barn were telling her, just let them die in peace, don't torture him. At the risk of her own life, because she never knew what the perimeter of the camp was, she would climb on a cherry tree. Everything at the lower level was eaten. Would take the twigs and new branches to make tea for me that eventually helped my stomach hold down food and nurtured me to health. As bad as the conditions were, people never gave up hope. The winter of 42 to 43 was one of the coldest in records. The undertakers would come in the morning with a sled, stop by the barn to see if anybody perished during the night. Just would put the person on the cart, like piling up wood. They took one of the barns and made a makeshift morgue. The ground was too frozen to bury somebody. In our tradition, you're supposed to stay with a deceased person until such time that they are buried. Well, they observed that. even more interesting. Under those horrible conditions, ladies and gentlemen, we had a wedding. The groom didn't have a shirt, probably borrowed it for some food or who knows what. But he had a tie. He was elegant, elegant. Our assignment for our camp was to work in the forest to cut timber for the Nazi fortifications. The men and women that were strong enough to do that were getting a little bit of brown water that they called coffee, a little piece of bread. At lunchtime, they would get some soup that you were lucky to find a rotten potato in it. Evening again, a little coffee and bread. Food was a tremendous shortage. And even in that particular shortage, a lot of people that were not used to hardship died. In our convoy, there were 1,500 people, only 300 of us survived. But they created an orphanage. They took care of the orphans. That's one of the main principles that Jewish observance. Take care of the poor and the orphans. My stepfather's brother-in-law, you see his wife in this picture to my left, was a cantor. They allegedly have good voices. They're people that sing the prayers in our synagogue. He formed a children's choir, did everything possible to keep their mind off the atrocities going on around them. Remember I told you to pack what we can carry? Education is so important. People brought books along. The women that were too old to work or too sick, they were our teachers. I remember writing with a pencil so small I practically wrote with my fingers. And our job, in addition to learning, was to provide enough wood to keep the fire going. I remember a Nazi group came to investigate our camp. They gave me a piece of chocolate. Ladies and gentlemen, it's like giving you a piece of gold. I had to wait for my mother to come home so she can divide it equally for my cousin and myself. We shared everything. She had to throw it away because it could have been poison. They were poisoning food, booby-trapping toys, doing everything possible, trying to destroy us. The pictures that you see now, the one farthest to your left, it's my grandmother and my cousin, who, by the way, lives in Indianapolis. And the little guy, I'm very proud of that picture. If you notice on the bottom, it was taken in 1939, way before Elvis Presley's parents even knew each other, and I was wearing a white suit already. The picture in the middle shows part of my mother's family and my uncle. The picture farthest to the right was taken after the camp. And there, I have already managed to gain some weight. As you can see, my presentation is totally unrehearsed. When we were liberated, partisans came up and they said, "You're free to go." Go where? Romania didn't want us back. Russia didn't want us. The Germans definitely didn't want us. So we worked our way back, going from little village to little village, gaining strength. And the international community was making arrangements for us to be repatriated, allowed to return to the country of their residence. But prior to that, an event took place that made me super proud of my family. Towards the end of our stay, because of my relationship my mother had with a Ukrainian woman, they gave us a small little abandoned house. One cold, rainy, snowy night, somebody knocks at the door. They were 3 Nazi officers. They took all their insignias off and everything. They were trying to escape the advancing Russian army. Ask us if they can spend the night. My family and the other family living in that house had a little conference, and to my pride, they let them come in. One of the Nazi officers was a little bit inebriated, maybe even totally drunk, but he was making derogatory comments about Jews and singing these Nazi marching songs. The other 2 guys took him outside. When he came back, he was a little bloody, but a changed person. My aunt happens to notice that one of the officers was wearing a wedding band. He asked him if he heard from his wife. He started to cry. He just heard that she was killed during the bombing of Berlin. We finally returned to our city of origin, Struzinets. We lived in my grandfather's partially bombed out house. I remember it was across the street from a park. So my cousin and I, one day in the winter, we were playing in the park. We saw this cute little dog. All right, we had to have a dog. So the dog ran into the lake. The ice didn't break with him, but when I stepped on the ice, I went under. Fortunately, they fished me out. They brought me to the house, and that's the first time in my life that I had some hot wine. I still do that, but without falling in the lake. Eventually, they decided that we are allowed to return to Romania. We came to Bucharest, and then my mother remarried, and we moved to Arad. I started first grade 3 times. By the time we got to Arad, they thought that I might be mentally handicapped. We are still debating that, but fortunately, a teacher took interest in me, and she realized that that is a language barrier. She took me to a school where the predominant language of instruction was German. Suddenly, I wound up in 3rd grade. I was very skinny, undernourished, weak. She prescribed what today would be considered physical therapy. I had to do push-ups, I had to run, I had to lift weights, didn't have weights, a couple of buckets of water. And this is how I developed and I regained my strength. I could not get into the university because I had relatives not only in the United States, but also in Israel. So they had no interest of educating me, although I went to a very good school. I was always admitted without place. I learned the trade. I was working in the first clock factory in the country. And starting at the base, at the bottom, when the prototype was just produced, I worked my way up to a supervisory position. One day, the director of the factory, who was the nicest person you want to meet, calls me to his office. To his right was sitting the secretary of the Communist Party for our factory. To his left, you recognize from a mile away, Secret Service. I knew those guys because I played volleyball for a team that they sponsored. And this nice director starts to call me every name in the book. You're a traitor, you're undeserving of our trust and our everything. Starting tomorrow, you're going to sweep the floors in the factory. No, starting today, get out of here. Half an hour, 45 minutes later, he calls me back, closes the door behind us, throws his arms around me, said, "You lucky dog, you're leaving for the United States." It took us 14 years to get the exit visa. Finally, one day, they were trying to show the international community that nobody wants to leave. So on our highest holiday, the Day of Atonement, when even the most secular Jew is in the synagogue, they decided, if you want to leave the country, come to the police station to register. Dilemma. The rabbi said, you know what? We can pray later. If enough of us show up, they cannot arrest everybody. The line was like 2 blocks around the police station. People applying to leave. Eventually, international community was photographing everything, recording it, so they had no way out. They started to leave the old people out first, but there is a very, 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 very Romanian tradition. It's called bakshish. For those of you that do not speak Romanian, it means bribe. If you can bribe the right person, you can get just about anything that you want. My uncle found out who to bribe, and that's how we got our exit visa. I was 22 years old when we came to Vienna. That's when I had my first real banana. We did not know who we can trust, who we can talk to. We did not know who we can trust, what to do. I'm not exercising here. What is it? This is what I looked like when we came to Iraq, when the teacher decided to give me physical therapy. Look how my ears stick out like caricatures of our president. But I'm not quite as smart as he is. And this is how I looked a year later after some physical therapy. This shows you our synagogue. The one picture to the farthest right, and I don't know why my little point doesn't work, it's too light. This is the house that we live. It was called the greenhouse, and a lot of people that had just got out of the concentration camp lived there. They were 10 boys around the same age and only one girl. You can imagine the friendships that they formed. The Nazis, unfortunately, were masters of the sea. They had this camp in the Czech Republic. It's called Tereznik or Theresienstadt in German. That was a model camp. What you're looking at is an exercise yard and the world-famous sign, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. The international community finally got wise, and they saw that so many people are leaving and very few of them are returning. So they wanted to inspect one of the camps. So the Nazis said, sure, come on, go to Theresienstadt. You probably saw those pictures with the black and gray pajamas like the stripes. Over here, they were allowed to wear their own clothes. The Nazi propaganda went as far as allowing them to put on a show making fun of Hitler. Unfortunately, after the Red Cross left, everybody in that show was killed. These show the accommodations. They had nice double bunks, just to show the world. Again, parents tried to do everything possible to keep the children's minds off the atrocities going on. My wife and I visited there in 2004, and I saw the original pictures. They're all happy pictures. They didn't want any sad things. After a while, where this was originally a transition point, they decided they're wasting too much energy and time by transporting people to other camps. So they decided to just build a crematorium, an oven on the side. The wall that you see there on top, It's not a dilapidated wall. Those are bullet holes. They shot the people there, and when the war was over, we saw they've had enough bodies to fill 2 cemeteries. It is now a museum. All right, this is my passport picture. I came to the United States, stopped in New York at my aunt's house. The first thing that she did, gave me $2 to get a haircut. Because I was a hippie before they were even popular in this country. I didn't know better. I was in the country for 1 year. Uncle Sam was very generous, gave me the opportunity to learn the language. Then I was drafted into the Army. My basic training was in Fort Knox. Cold, miserable. Again, Army intelligence is an oxymoron. They tested me in languages, all right? First of all, general information, like how many players in a baseball team, I had no idea. I grew up playing soccer. How many points of conversion at football touchdown? I had no idea. I played soccer. So then I did high in math, and then the languages. The first test they gave me in language was in Romanian, which is the language that I was educated in. 50 questions, true, false. The second test they gave me, the same identical questions and answers in German. By the time I took it in Russian and French and Hungarian, I could have taken any language and passed. So the company commander was very intrigued that this moron that doesn't know these basic things speaks 5 languages. So he decided to meet me. And he was so excited, he said, we're going to send you to California to our Army Intelligence Language School. Imagine leaving the cold, frozen Fort Knox, going to Southern California. Beautiful. Only to find out I cannot get into that school because I was not a citizen. So they kept me in California, Fort Ord, and then of all the places that in their wisdom they decided I would be most useful was Germany. So they sent me to Germany. It sounds terrible. What's a Jewish boy going to do in Germany? Well, for me, it was actually a wonderful experience. I know their literature, I know their language. I could not believe that every German was brainwashed. And I was proven right. I made some friends, it was absolutely incredible. At one point, they invited me to join a swim club. And I told them, well, I'm American. No, that's okay, we can arrange for you to get a free pass. So I thought I'd drop a bomb. I said, well, I'm also Jewish. He said, in that case, I insist you visit our club. What's the name of your club? Young German Catholics. They treated me so wonderful. I couldn't take part in their swim schedule, but I played table tennis for their team. Took me all over the country. I had another friend who even looked alike. He was a salesman. And at Christmas time, all the companies that he was selling to were having these tremendous parties. He took me along, introducing me as his brother, full well knowing that I'm Jewish. He took me on a skiing vacation to Austria. So those are the Germans as opposed to the Nazis. They kept me there, and I was the unofficial company interpreter. Sometimes one of our trucks or something would run over a chicken. Suddenly that was the best egg-laying chicken in the country. The tree, damaged the tree, they would go there. It was absolutely beautiful. And I had to negotiate these things. It was fun. Now this is false advertisement. Conrad Weiner, educator. A few months ago, I couldn't spell the word. Now I is one. it is very important to realize that if somebody, one of us hurts, it's not very long before the next person will hurt. We have to help. Somebody asked me at one of my presentations, do you regret being born Jewish? Now, how do you answer that? So I did some research, and I find out, as you can see, I'm in pretty good company. If you look under chemistry, Nobel Prize, 20% of the total world population and so on. So I had this as a motivation, excusing myself for being Jewish. On our initial presentation, my oldest son brought my granddaughters, and much to my dismay, because the oldest one was 10 years old at that time. The next day, she gave me this poem. And that makes me realize that at least I touched one person. I would not do anybody justice if I would not mention the number of Gentiles that risked their own life to save Jewish people, Jewish children in particular. There was a case of a Polish nurse that saved 2,500 children. The students doing the research thought it was a typo. They found out, in fact, that's a true figure. The most important example to me, how good deeds get rewarded immediately, very quickly, is that of a lowly Polish seminary student. He saved a Jewish woman who he found in the street, almost beaten to death, bloody, took her to a house, saved her. Later he became a priest in a small little town, Krakow. The people, his neighbors, were taking charge of a Jewish boys whose parents thought they're going to be executed. They fell in love with a kid. They went to the priest asking him to convert them to Catholicism. The priest said, look, they trusted you with their most important possession. Therefore, let's wait. If they don't come back, we talk about it. Second year, the same story. As fate would have it, the parents came back. They claimed their child. Years later, that lowly priest from Krakow became John Paul II. I will conclude, I usually get applause when I say that, I will conclude by telling you how fortunate I am and how easy it is to get used to the better things in life. I owe a great deal of gratitude to your state of Indiana and to your institutions of higher learning. I was arguably educated by your sister university in Bloomington, Indiana. My oldest son was born in Bloomington. That's why he's so smart. A big part of my family lived for many, many years in Indianapolis. As I mentioned before, in Romania, I could not go to college. In the United States, thanks to the GI Bill, and Indiana University being so generous with their advanced credits, I completed their program in 2 years instead of 4. They educated me so well that the University of Cincinnati gave me a full scholarship in their Masters of Business program. I couldn't get 1 degree. United States, I have 2 degrees. In my future in Romania, if I keep my nose clean, I stay out of jail. My future in the United States, I have 2 sons, both college educated, both on their own, no boomerang kids in our house. I already have an investment on a return on my investment. 2 great-granddaughters, 10 and 13 years old. 48 years, only one wife. Can't have 2 of everything. I thank you for your attention, and if you have any question, I'd be glad to answer. If I don't know the answer, I do like a professor, I make it up. Because if you would know the answer, you wouldn't ask me the question. Please, not everybody at the same time. All right, I anticipated that. At a great expense, $2.25 for 250 business cards, I printed my email address. If you think of some questions, please feel free to take a card, and I will be sure to answer you. I thank you for your attention.